Okay, this is deadly because I usually don't speak 15 minutes to my students ever, They're just pretty much gone after 2 minutes. And also, very much I feel like I'm an imposter at this conference. But I really do want to thank the Asian Canadian Writers Workshop for having me, and the spirit of Jim Wong Chu, who always gave emerging artists a chance. And I think very much I'm in that, class category. So, could you hand out my handouts? Being the teacher that I am, of course, you have to have handouts. So we're going to do the handouts. Yeah, I think there's 30 of them. There should be enough for the room. Yeah, there's a quiz, so read. Pay attention and read. So how many people have heard of Irish Chang? Not my relatives. Not my relatives. Okay. How many people have heard of Chen Qiushen? Not my relatives. My daughter's putting her hand up. All right, so you haven't, right? People haven't heard of them. So I think part of how we can move on as artists with our work is when people know our history. And we can't get into more complex topics until people start to know our history. We keep rehashing the same things, the discrimination, the tropes and everything else. I think until everybody knows our history, right, we're not going to be able to move on. So I also want to say that there are more Chinese restaurants in the U.S. than McDonald's, Burger King, and Wendy's combined. So it's a huge economic force. And one of the things I'm very interested in writing about is some of the women who ran, I think, who's the Governor General who was Chinese Canadian? No, was there one before that restaurateur in Toronto? Does anybody know? Yeah, I think there was, and so a lot of these, especially during the 60s and 70s, a lot of these restaurants became actually political centers. And in Seattle, where I live, sorry, I came up for this. I'm still Canadian at heart, raised in Strathcona. We have a woman called Ruby Chow, and she was the first King County councilperson. Asian American to get that position. She ran a restaurant, and she was her husband was Ping, and he was a Cantonese opera star, and he was friends with Bruce Lee's parents. So when Bruce Lee first came over, he worked at their restaurant. He lived in the attic, and I have friends who he taught martial arts, you think? No, he taught ballroom dancing to my friends. He was a great ballroom dancer. And so there's a huge amount of history about, and I actually speculate a lot about the relationship between Ruby and Bruce Lee, because she was very, very hard on him. But a lot of his aspiration for greatness, I think, came from that time. So, but she used to have all the politicians, because politicians loved Chinese food, and she would have all the politicians in her restaurant all the time. It became a kind of political hub, and actually one of the senators in our state came up with the act that got rid of the Chinese exclusion, and it could have been from that influence. He loved her Peking duck, so that's Peking duck diplomacy. But unless we know our history, right, we actually can't even write about the more complex things. So this is one of those complex things. I don't have any advice for people, because I don't think I create anything. The whole feeling I had when I did this piece was I was uncovering it. It was there. And, I just had to uncover it and do it in the best way I could, to really uncover it in its full glory. So it started out a long time ago, and Roger Tang helped me do a reading of this over 20 years ago. And at that time, it was mainly about Chen Shishun, who was he was a rocket science, literally a rocket science, who was sent back to China during McCarthyism. They said he was a communist, and he was sent back. And there was a whole bunch of very brilliant scientists that were sent back to China at that time, including the ones that developed the atomic bomb for China in the 60s. So they sent back just a whole bunch of brilliant scientists who probably wanted to stay in America. It was the time of the communist, revolution, and they had taken over, and a lot of these people were, part of the elite class and so forth, but they were all sent back. He was one of them. So a brilliant person, right? So he developed the silkworm missile for China, which is, very much in use. He developed a satellite and their whole space program. He mentored a whole generation of scientists, and he also, he actually was part of the organization because he was a very good manager, very good systems thinker, that actually helped with the atomic bomb. So the fact that China was able to do the atomic bomb, right, with nothing, they had nothing, no resources the Soviets had pulled out, was because of these very brilliant scientists that were, actually pushed back to China. So that's his story. He became, of course, a hero, but also went through a lot during the Cultural Revolution. He was protected by Zhou Enlai. But, he kind of made it through that, and then eventually he died when he was 98. He was a national treasure. He was deified, pretty much, because they were looking for, after Mao passed, they were looking for a new kind of hero that the nation could rally around. They wanted that scientific hero, the technical superior, and his story was exactly what they wanted. He wasn't thrown out of, he wasn't deported out of America. He chose to leave because he was a Marxist, and he wanted to leave, and he of course repeated the same story. He became a communist. He was a hero, and there's a museum to him. There's lots of films about him in China, and to speak anything but to say that he's had this path would be condemned in China. So Iris Chang was a brilliant Asian American woman who committed suicide at age 36. So she was a writer, and her first book was a biography of Chen Shishun. And she went to China, and she interviewed all the people, and she did this probably in the early 90s, before he was deified. So people would actually tell the truth about him. And she was very good at getting people to tell the truth. And and I guess at that time they were a little bit more willing to do that. And her parents were scientists, so they were able to also get scientists, who came on conferences and so forth, to tell the truth. And they would pretty much, they would badmouth him and, tell all the things that he did and how political he was and, all this kind of stuff, right? So I think she got the truth about him. Because after he was deified, you cannot find anything that, I've gotten 6 biographies on him. They do TV shows on him. It's really, I don't know how truthful it is. He says he will never write his autobiography. He never did. It was always written by his secretaries, and they're very, very complimentary and, all that. And there's no doubt he was brilliant. There's no doubt whatsoever that he was brilliant. So when he came to America because he needed to, learn about aeronautics. And this is in the very beginning. And he and his schoolmates, he went to MIT, and then he went to Caltech, and he followed von Karman, Theodor von Karman, who was probably, people don't know about him. He's the father of aerodynamics. He actually, you know, this all the speed of sound stuff and all that stuff. That was him, right? I mean, anybody you can speak to any aeronautics engineer and they will know von Karman. You know, he is definitely, again, another genius. And he was driven out of Europe because of Nazism. So he left Europe. He was actually in Germany, and he left Europe. Originally Hungarian, right? But was living in Germany and teaching in Germany, and was about to become a professor there and so forth. And he was sent. And he left because the Nazis took over, and he was a Hungarian Jew. So there's a whole. Have you heard of the Martians, the Hungarian Martians? So there's a whole group of Hungarians who are brilliant Hungarians, right? Johnny von Neumann, Cillard, the people that did the atomic bomb in the U.S., a lot of them were Hungarian Jews that came out of that group. They called them the Martians because they were so brilliant. They thought they're from outer space, but also because they couldn't understand them when they spoke Hungarian. So he was part of that group, and he ended up being in Caltech and teaching there. So Chen followed him. He interviewed, he followed him, and he became his mentor. So the two of them, right, and von Karman actually created the blueprint. So think of those days, right? It was like before airplanes, before rockets, before everything. And so they were just, when Chen first started, he was just a young guy with a bunch of other young guys at Caltech, and they were just blowing up things and having fun, that was their fun thing, to blow up stuff and send rockets up in the air in the desert, and they were going to fly to the moon. That was their goal, right? So that goal, right, for all of them turned into weapons, right, weaponry. So, his thing, he really wanted to have, like a supersonic flight between continents and so forth. And it was really about flying, the kind of exhilaration of flying, right? But it just, of course, the Air Force and military got hold of them, and they were doing ballistic missiles next and all that kind of stuff. So, and that's where the funding was coming from. And that's von Karman. He created the blueprint for the Air Force in the U.S., which actually Chen helped him with. And I think the feeling is that Chen probably did most of it, because von Karman was a professor, a little bit older, and Chen did all the work. So he took that, so that he passed that knowledge to Chen. And there's some, Chen never said that he was smarter than von Karman or did better than von Karman. He was very much revered him as a teacher, right? He revered him, and. But some people feel like Chen surpassed him, right? So that whole thing. So anyways, this is all about Iris, who never met Chen, but wrote and knew really a lot about him intimately. But she died before he did. She was 36 when she died, and he was 98. So they meet all the time. So in this piece, they meet in the Bardo, which is the in-between for Tibetan Buddhism, and they talk there. So it was very hard. So I'm really thrilled, because the piece, the clip you're going to see is, so the whole thing was, it was incredibly hard to cast Chen, right? So there are a few Asian American actors who could do the Iris part, because she's an Asian American woman and people have that lived experience. But and to do Chen from the time he was 26, right, when he was a PhD student of von Karman, to the time he's 98 when he's dead. And also in the scene you're seeing here, when he says goodbye to von Karman, when he's being deported. And so I think you can kind of see. So von Karman also had a huge FBI file, because he came from Hungary and he actually worked for the Communist Party, because they were all recruited. And he had a huge FBI file too. They were all surveilled, right? All of them were. Some of his students, they were very activists. Some of them were actually, against, using this kind of weaponry in this way. So they all had FBI files, right? And Chen had one too. And so I mostly found him, right, through those, through Iris's book, which was really good, and also through these transcripts, all these transcripts of his interrogation. So finding him was very interesting. But it was Iris who drove it, right? So it's very hard, right, when someone commits suicide. And there was a lot of conjecture about why she did. She was at the peak of her career, but she was actually very, very much obsessed with atrocities and war atrocities. So she did a book on Chinese Americans, which everybody said, well, why are you doing that? You're not an expert in that. And then the next book she was going to do was Bataillon March, which was another a World War II atrocity. So she did Rape of Nanjing, which was a really big book for her. It made her an international best-selling author. And it was about the atrocities in Nanjing. And I can tell you, right, when you get the reports from the Ukraine, so a lot of people feel very repelled by the piece because the women, right, the surviving women, the voices of those women, and these are the voices that Iris spoke for when she wrote her book on the Rape of Nanjing. They talk in the play, and they tell horrific things. And I've brought this to a lot of workshops. I brought it to playwrights and everything. They said, well, this is atrocity porn. I don't know if it's going to go. And so, but when you look at that screen and you see what's happening in Ukraine, it's the same stuff. It's exactly the same stuff. It happens in any war. So it was this whole thing about, so the fight in the piece, as Iris says, she actually said it was a Holocaust. And so people questioned in ours, like the numbers, right? Is it just about numbers? And so, so anyways, she was very, that made her very, some people speculate that she was bipolar, and maybe that triggered all this kind of stress, triggered what happened. But she just kept going back, right, to writing about atrocities and trying to get something done about it. So so the piece is very kind of dark, and it's about a very serious subject. It's just chock full of like all kinds of history, and it's about science, right? So Rogi has to talk about scientific studies. He's like, he's talking about, attack angle of, all kinds of things. So there's a lot of things that are not in your typical play. And the thing was, Heidi Taylor was the one who first talked about this when I was trying to work through this at the very beginning. It was a VAC workshop that for some reason they chose me for. And I was assigned Heidi Taylor, and she is just a miracle person, but also totally supportive. For someone who had like a play that was in pieces, I mean, it was actually in pieces. It was totally, torn apart, because it was only about Chen in the beginning, and then I threw in Iris, and it was trying to kind of work the two of them together. So that was the thing, was to try, but she was totally supportive. That whole experience of working with VAC and putting that reading together was the best thing that I have, it was just exhilarating that these people had so much faith in this kind of pieced together play. And then I rewrote it and then asked Heidi again, what can I do? And she got Rogi, and Rogi pretty much cast the whole thing. And so the great news is you're going to see his acting. And he inhabited this role. And not only that, but because he had this, rapport going with Evelyn, who plays Iris, they just totally clicked. They just totally clicked. It was just, you could see them come to life. And Evelyn looks so much like Iris. It's like scary. And so she's not in this, so you're going to see him with von Karman. And this is the passing of the thing, right? Because von Karman did not help. He did not help him, right, when he was being deported. He didn't help. He didn't interfere. He didn't help at all. Even though he had the ear of all the generals and everything, he did not help. And so this is the scene where they're saying goodbye.